With Homoda's old partner in time, Mabayu, showing up in the Magia Exedra opening, it seems like the official prequel to Madoka Magica, called Scene Zero, may also play a core role in Magia Exedra. But first, let's start with the beginning of the opening. We start by flying into the lighthouse where Exedra takes place, and we are greeted by Yoraka, Namae, and AQ. Now Yoraka has this thing on the left here, which I think in English is just going to be called Nighthawk, who acts as a shopkeeper, and that's all we know about that thing. It looks kind of weird, so there's definitely something going on with them, but we're going to have to wait for the game to come out to actually check out what their deal is. We also have AQ, of course, the green Kyubey, although my guess is that this is not actually a Kyubey at all. It's simply a construct of the Law of Cycles, since the lighthouse is part of the Law of Cycles that simply looks like a Kyubey. We also of course have Namae, or name in English, who I assume will be the character that you give your own player name to when the game starts. And we also don't really know that much about Namae right now, but of course once the game starts we're going to be exploring the story. We then see some quick shots of Madoka and Homoda, of Sayaka and Kyoko, and of Mami and Nagisa. However, I'm gonna assume that everyone watching this will know about the Pulamagi Holy Quintet as well as Nagisa, so I'm not gonna talk about these guys today. So here we come to one of the most exciting characters in the entire opening, it's Mabayu. Mabayu has already gotten some sort of a cult following for being the 6th member of the Pulamagi Holy Quintet, who has always been there, but was kind of forgotten by everyone. She is the protagonist of Scene Zero, which is the official prequel to Madoka Magica, and if you've never heard about it, that's because the creators behind Scene Zero didn't really know where to put the story and how to make it. There are some rumors that originally it was supposed to be an anime, maybe it could have been a manga instead. However, the creators decided that the best place to put this story is to put it as a story within Magia Record. Now, an important thing to note is that Magia Record has absolutely no connection to Scene Zero, and Scene Zero is placed in its own universe that has nothing to do with Magia Record. However, the only way to read Scene Zero was to read it from within Magia Record. The basic idea behind Scene Zero's story is that Mabayu has forgotten how she became a magical girl and is now somehow time looping together with Homoda. This now means that together with the Pulamagi Holy Quintet and specifically Homoda, Mabayu has to now figure out how she became a magical girl in the first place, what her wish has to do with any of this, and how to get out of this. Character-wise, you could say that Mabayu is somewhat of a fail girl who spends most of her days simply watching movies at home and not really having many friends. But at least she likes hanging out with her auntie who owns a cafe that the Pulamagi Holy Quintet also sometimes visits. Because she loves movies so much, her design and her powers are all themed around the movies, with her power being able to not just view the future, but rearrange and even cut memories, just how an editor would cut film together. It can be believed that the events of Scene Zero are somehow entirely canon to Pulamagi Madoka Magica, but how exactly that works, that is for the readers to figure out. Continuing on with the opening, we then, after a few more quick shots, see a shot of Iroha and Ui standing on the railroad tracks that lead to Kamihama City. Now, I have made a video before this where I talk about all of the Magia Record characters that are in the Magia Exedra release roster, and that video, for example, also included an introduction of Iroha, so I'm not going to talk about her again, but you can check that video out if you want to. However, I haven't talked about Ui yet because she wasn't in that video. Now, I can't talk too much about Ui sadly, since Magia Records Arc 1 has as its core mystery the question what happened to Ui, since Ui seems to have been somehow erased from existence and only Iroha remembers that she exists. But I will say that she's a rather naive and childish person who has at least a very optimistic worldview. But figuring out what exactly happened to her, that's going to be an important part, and I'm going to have to defer to Magia Exedra to explore that question. Moving on, we then see Tsuruno and Yachio, who I've also talked about in the roster video before this, but then we have an extremely important shot that shows 4 more characters that I have not talked about before. These are Alina, Toka, Nemu, and Mifuyu. Starting with the character that I'm going to have the most amount of stuff to say in this video, and also the character who is going to cast the biggest waves across the entire Madoka community, Alina Grey. If you ask people who their most beloved and their most hated Magia Record characters are, Alina somehow is at the top of both of their lists. For some people, even at the top of both of their personal lists. And she's definitely going to continue being a divisive character in Exedra as well, so get ready for that. Let me talk about her backstory. Generally, she is an artist who makes art specifically about death and the dead. Like, for example, she might arrange carcasses of animals in some funny shapes, and that's art. However, this of course means that a lot of people are going to try and read into that art and try to analyze her, psychoanalyze her personally. There's also going to be critics that might analyze her, and one in particular might have said to her that she's lacking something of a mission statement, of a reason to do art. Now this was kind of weird for Aina because she just doesn't really care about being analyzed or having a mission statement or anything like that. She just wants to make art that she personally just wants to make. So of course, what does Aina do? She wants to create the ultimate piece of art that shows the world who she really is by making the art that symbolizes herself to the world. And to do that, she threw herself off a building and landed in front of a rolling camera so that it could film her decomposing corpse. Luckily for her, she made a contract with Cubase just a minute before that, so turns out magical girls don't actually die that easily. A really important part of her character is that she's best friends with Karin, who I talked about in the video before this, and she's an extremely harsh and rude critic of her best friend Karin's manga art. And you can kind of tell that she just doesn't really know how to talk to people other than getting angry and screaming and saying some really harsh and evil stuff. But ultimately, she actually genuinely wants to help, and you can see that she actually gets happy whenever Karin does make progress. However, in the actual main story, outside of her backstory, she acts as one of the primary antagonists of the Arc 1 main story, who wants to raise witches because she thinks witches are pretty beautiful, which, they are, so she wants to raise them as part of her art. And this leads to some of her most iconic scenes where she just acts extremely eccentric, over-the-top flamboyant. She basically becomes a JoJo character whenever she confronts the main characters and does actual JoJo poses in the middle of that. So you have a character who doesn't really know how to talk to people, but genuinely wants people to improve and become better people and become better at their craft, but who is also over-the-top, eccentric, flamboyant, does JoJo poses, is extremely loud, says some really evil, harsh and rude stuff. Personally, I love her, but I can see how you can either put yourself in the camp of you love her, or you put yourself in the camp of you hate her, and some people are in both camps. Now, Alina is one of the leaders of an organization called Magius, which are trying to save magical girls by having instituted something called the Doppel system, which I'm not going to go into here because that's for the story to do. But we can now move on to the next leader of the Magius, Toka. Toka's an annoying little brat that I want to throw off a cliff. She's basically a science neckbeard redditor who, whenever anyone talks about anything, has to chime in and say, well, actually, force is not mass times acceleration. It's actually mass times acceleration plus the change of mass over time times velocity. She used to be in a hospital together with Oi and Nemu before the story started, and is now, after some stuff happened, a magical girl who is trying to save all of magical girls, with the ultimate goal of somehow advancing humanity to the point where everyone can take to space. And you know what, if she wants to go to space, why wait? Moving on, we have Nemu, who is a very calm and collected and very calculated personality. She likes reading and writing books, and if Toka is the redditor, then she's probably that weird person on Tumblr who keeps writing their own fanfic. She's not really someone who is very active within the story and usually just gets dragged around from scene to scene by the people around her, but ultimately the reason she writes stories and just goes along with other people is because she just wants to feel loved and accepted. And moving on to the last of the Magius leaders, we have Mifuyu, who is actually an old childhood friend of Yachio. In fact, just like Yachio, she's also been a magical girl for somewhere around 7 years at this point. Now, Mifuyu is the kind of personality who I guess I would also somewhat describe as a fail girl, since she's trying to be a shining example. She's trying to be a leader who guides other people to do the right thing. However, she keeps messing up all the time, making bad decisions, and has now fallen in with a bad crowd. Well, sucks to be her. Actually, now finally moving on with the opening, we then see another shot of Felicia and Sana, who I've already talked about in a video before this, so I'm gonna skip these guys as well. And then a couple of quick shots that show a whole bunch of new characters, starting with this shot right here that shows the Kamore triangle. Now, these three I've actually talked about in the video before this, but then we also have a character that is entirely new in this shot. And that is Mitama, also one of the most popular and best characters that Manga Record has brought forward. Now, unlike most Manga Record characters that are actually kind of simple and shallow, she's actually somewhat of a more complex character, and that's very much appreciated. She is someone who, in her backstory, was at the bottom, was chewed out by society, and in a moment of weakness made a terrible wish that she regretted immediately. However, afterwards she then made many friends, maybe Momoko even closer than a friend, wink wink, and also developed a more jovial and a somewhat fun-loving personality where she just loves to joke around, not take anything seriously, and loves teasing people. All of that is at least partially a defense mechanism, of course, for hiding the darkness that lurks underneath. So of course, if you put all of that together, the complexity of her character having both this darker underlying stuff, but also how she tries to hide it behind joking and teasing, as well as just generally a bit more foxy nature, all of that of course is a recipe for popularity. On top of all of that, she is somewhat of a pretty unique character for a position in the story. You see, she is someone called a coordinator, who are just very, very few magical girls that made a similar wish than the one that she made, where they're somehow now able to dig into people's soul gems and rewire their magic abilities. Now this is used in-game to basically say why it's possible to strengthen characters and make them more powerful, but can also just randomly unlock new costumes and new abilities for characters in the story. For example, she just randomly gave Kyoko a swimsuit that also made her magically able to swim because she wasn't able to swim before. Back to the OP, we then get a quick shot that lasts only a few frames, where we get introduced to the Amane sisters, or just colloquially known as the Neys. The story of the Neys plays something like a teen drama / comedy, where it turns out when they were born as twins, their parents divorced right after they were born, so they were separated at birth and didn't know that the other existed. But later on in life, they somehow randomly were able to find each other. But whoops, it turns out one of them grew up in a rich neighborhood and is all dignified and rather collected, while the other one grew up in a rather poor neighborhood and is a lot more energetic and rude. However, they were ultimately able to overcome their differences and wish to never be separate again. However, now in the main story of My Girl Record, they basically just act like very minor antagonists that sometimes show up as servants of the Magius and just fight the protagonist for a little bit and then immediately get destroyed and run away. They're basically the Team Rocket of this game. The quick shots of the opening continue, and in this very next quick shot we see Karin, who I've talked about in the video before this, as well as Comrade Kanagi. Kanagi is an extremely forceful and dominating character who grew up in a very poor neighborhood but is now trying to use her own powers to fight back against inequality and seize the means of production. Although you do kind of have to make money somehow, so she also works at a maid cafe where she's known as basically the dominating and cold-hearted maid who says mean stuff to you, and the guys love it. She also happens to be best friends with Mitama, and just like Mitama, she also kind of hates the world and tries to hide the darkness of wanting to lash back at the world deep inside. Although there have been multiple instances now of her actually lashing out and taking that darkness within her out, and it led to a lot of fan service as well. But don't worry, she's 18, so it's fine. In the opening, there's now one last very quick shot of Asuka, but I also already talked about her, so nothing more special to talk about here. The last few important scenes that we now see in the opening are multiple scenes that show all of the Madoka Magica spin-offs one after another. Now these manga spin-offs, they have been out for a really long time, and if you just go to Google and you search for how to read them, you'll probably find ways of either buying them, which you should if you can, or reading them online if you have no other way of buying them. And all of these spin-offs are rather short, so you can actually just go out and read all of these spin-offs that are about to appear right here within a day. So I'm not going to talk too much about all of these characters. I'm not going to spoil too much of any of these stories because I want you to go out and actually read these stories, because it really doesn't take very long to read through all these stories. However, at least as a quick overview, we see the first scene right here with Suzune standing in the middle, who is a very cold and pragmatic character who doesn't mind getting her hands dirty if necessary. We then also see next to her Matsuri, who, quite differently from Suzune, is a very warm personality and very optimistic person. And far in the background we see the mother figure and basically the mother Megoka, Tsubaki. We then see a shot of both Oriko and Kirika. Oriko being also a very rather cold personality, and that is because she's the antagonist of that spin-off, who also doesn't mind getting her hands dirty. However, she doesn't want to do that herself and usually sends her servant Kirika to do it. And Kirika is basically the attack dog of Oriko, who goes out and hunts other characters. Kirika is very deeply in love with Oriko and doesn't mind showing a bit of a more crazy side of her if it's about Oriko. Then we see another quick shot that I'm not going to talk too much about, because the location these characters are standing in is quite of a big spoiler for Kazumi Magica, and it's quite interesting that they chose this location for this scene. At least about the characters, in the very far background we have Umika, who reads and writes books and is an author and is very analytical. Next to her is the more energetic football player Kaoru. And then in the front, of course, we have the titular Kazumi, who is also very energetic and very positive and optimistic about life. We then see another spin-off right here. It's Tart Magica, where in the center we have the titular Tart, who is the historical Jeanne d'Arc. And next to her we have Italian Homura, also known as Liz, who her personality is being Italian Homura. On the other side of her we see Melissa, who might come across as rather meek at first, but gets extremely angry very quickly. The next shot and most of the rest of the trailer doesn't introduce any more characters, so the character introduction part is over at this point. However, I will mention that the first green flash that whizzes past the characters is indeed Kazumi. And the second green flashes that appear are indeed Liz and Tart. Since this is just a fight scene, we've basically arrived at the end of the opening at this point, so I hope that you were able to learn at least a little bit about these characters. And yeah, I'll see you when the game goes live. Hit a subscribe button, ring the bell, and I'll be streaming the game as well. So check the description for the stream as well, and I'll see you guys next time.